And welcome. I am Christopher James Blythe, and I am the author of Terrible Revolution, Latter-day Saints, and the American Apocalypse, which will be published by Oxford University Press this July. Thank you for joining me for this virtual reading. Today is June 27th, 2020, and it is 176 years from when Joseph Smith, Jr. was assassinated in Carthage, Illinois. To recognize this event, I have selected a reading from Chapter 2 of Terrible Revolution, entitled Long Shall His Blood Stain Illinois, Martyrology and Malediction. This chapter looks at an idea that Samuel Brown introduces in his book, In Heaven as It Is on Earth, namely, that Latter-day Saints believe Joseph Smith was the final martyr. The material I'll read tonight focuses on the idea of martyrology, how this idea related to last days expectations among Latter-day Saints. If you enjoy the reading, you can find Terrible Revolution from a variety of retailers, including Amazon.com. On June 27, 1844, Joseph and Hiram Smith were both assassinated when the jail at Carthage, Illinois, was overrun by an armed mob painted black of from 150 to 200 persons. At 5 p.m., Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, John Taylor, and Willard Richards were located in a bedroom on the second floor when multiple gunmen charged up the stairs as others aimed into the window from the courtyard below. The four Latter-day Saints endeavored to stave off their attackers by blocking the door with their bodies, and when that proved futile, by deflecting the muskets that appeared through the partially opened doorway with the aid of a cane. Hiram Smith was the first to fall, shot in the face. Taylor recalled the patriarch's final words as he collapsed to the floor, "I am a dead man." Taylor was next to be shot, taking a bullet to the left thigh. He took shelter under the bed, although he was hit 3 more times. The final bullet struck him, quote, on the fleshy part of my left hip, dashing the mangled fragments of flesh and blood against the wall, end quote. Both Taylor and Richards would survive the attack. Sometime during the action, Smith emptied his 6-shooter into the hallway. With no other means of defense, he tried to leap from the window, but according to some accounts, while he did so, he was shot dead, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." The Mormon prophet was struck a total of 4 times. One bullet, quote, entered his right hip and exited through the lower body. Another, quote, entered his right chest and exited below the shoulder blade. A third hit under the heart, and the final, quote, shot may have hit the right collarbone, end quote. There are contradictions in the sources and a debate in the historiography about whether these bullets all found their mark while Smith was still standing in the second floor of the jail, or after he had fallen from the window and landed on the ground below. John Taylor, for example, noted that the bodies of both Hiram and Joseph were, in an act of brutality, shot after they were dead. Other accounts suggest that Joseph survived the fall, only to then be killed by firing squad while propped against a well in the jail's courtyard. Even before the bodies of Joseph and Hiram were returned to Nauvoo, before any orators had eulogized them, before any individuals mourned their deaths, Latter-day Saints already had a robust and distinctive martyrology by which to make sense of their loss. The Smith brothers were not the first Mormon martyrs. There was Andrew Barber, killed in an 1833 Jackson County skirmish, whose body Mary Elizabeth Lightner Rollins described as, quote, a more heavenly corpse I never saw or expect to see on the face of the earth. His face was so happy, end quote. There was also David Patton, who was killed at the Battle of Crooked River, and whose slow death had been memorialized in the Journal of Heber C. Kimball. There were the 17 men and boys slaughtered, and in some cases dismembered, at Haun's Mill. The count of martyrs rose to hundreds when Mormons considered all the deaths from exposure and disease that occurred as a consequence of their forced exile. It amounted to thousands when the status, or at least a share in the status, was granted to those who had survived such hardships. Mormons were not the only Christians in early America to find meaning in stories of martyrdom. Quakers and Baptists still remembered their own early American persecutions. Anglo-Protestants more generally look back on their persecutions in early modern England. They still imagined a Roman Catholic menace eager to shed blood, defile innocent Protestant women, and enslave the minds of the faithful. Charles Buck's Popular Theological Dictionary included a lengthy entry on both martyr and martyrology. While disparaging Roman Catholic martyrologies as full of superstition and interpolation, Buck presented the sheer number and, quote, fortitude of those who have suffered for Christianity as a collateral proof, at least of its excellency, end quote. Martyrdom might not offer conclusive evidence of Christianity's truthfulness, but the willingness of so, quote, many wise and good men, end quote, to die for their beliefs would, quote, certainly afford something considerable in its favor, end quote. In the antebellum era, stories of martyrdom were still occasionally used as a means of educating children on their Christian duty. The year after Smith's death, the Child's Friend and Family magazine published a piece entitled Martyrs, which opens with a child insisting that his mother keep her promise to tell him more concerning the martyrs. The mother selects, quote, a terrible story in the Apocrypha, which was almost too terrible to relate, and which is yet so glorious and inspiring that I believe I must tell you, end quote. There were great religious lessons in the martyrs and their examples of the soul becoming, quote, supreme master, defying suffering, defying death, and still more defying the promise of all the pleasures of this life to turn from its allegiance to God. Martyr lore could be found in the scriptures, including both Testaments and the Apocrypha, still printed in most Bibles, but also in another volume regularly found in local libraries and Christian bookshelves. Like generations before them, many Americans still found inspiration in the pages of John Fox's Acts and Monuments, also known in the United States as the Book of the Martyrs. Mormons were also conversant with this Protestant classic and its themes. Edward Stevenson recalled that Joseph Smith had once borrowed his personal copy. When the Mormon prophet returned it, he told Stevenson, "I have seen those English martyrs by the aid of the Urim and Thummim. God has a salvation for them." For Joseph Smith, the content of the book and the significance of that content had been confirmed by supernatural means. Early Mormon writings occasionally borrowed from Fox's martyrology. For example, in 1844, Parley Pratt used Fox's treatise to describe the first-century apostolic martyrdoms. He described these men crucified, beheaded, sawn asunder, burned, torn by wild beasts, betrayed, shot, hung, boiled, roasted, imprisoned, starved, and tortured in 10,000 nameless ways, end quote. Mormons, almost universally raised as Protestants, were already schooled in the interpretive category of martyrdom, which is easily applied to their lived experience of persecution and conflict. The saints expected casualties at the hands of the wicked. After all, the Book of Mormon had portrayed the murder of the righteous as a necessary act, bringing on civilization's destruction. Mormons were convinced that it was their own blood that would topple Gentile society. Only months after the events of Hans Mill, Eliza R. Snow explained, quote, "The nations of the world can never fill the cup of their iniquity without shedding innocent blood, and the blood of the Latter-day Saints will, that of many of them, be required," end quote. Snow employed a phrase unique to Smith's revelations, the cup of their iniquity, to refer to the golden cup held by the female prostitute figure of Revelation chapter 17. This woman, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, is, in that text, quote, "drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus," end quote. Symbolizing the collective of persecutors, Babylon had filled her cup with her deeds, which would be repaid to her, quote, double in terms of plagues, death, mourning, and famine, end quote. But first, claimed Snow, she would need to fill her cup so God could in turn pour out the cup of his wrath. Once the saints had arrived in Commerce, Illinois, the apostles published a statement to comfort those who had endured hardships and persecutions in Missouri and who were now refugees along the river. The statement focused their attention on the apocalypse. Drawing again on the imagery of Revelation, the apostles pointed to the martyrs under the heavenly altar found in chapter 6. The ancient martyrs pled for justice. Quote, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" The response, they were to, quote, "rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled." Although the apostles' epistle consoled the saints with the assurance that, quote, "angels have gazed upon the scene, and your tears, your groans, your sorrows and anguish of heart are had in remembrance before God," there was no immediate promise of better times ahead. They instructed the fold to, quote, "be patient, then until the words of God to the martyrs be fulfilled, and his designs accomplished, and then shall he pour out his vengeance upon the devoted heads of your murderers, and then shall they know that he is God, and that you are his people." For the Mormons, to die at the hands of their oppressors was the act that would usher in the apocalypse. Further persecution and martyrdom were thus inevitable and expected. The martyrdom and emotion in Nauvoo. There was a collective effort to construct meaning from the unexpected tragedy of Joseph and Hyrum Smith's murders. From the first eulogy offered by W. W. Phelps, the Mormon prophet's martyrdom became the predominant theme in sermons and the writings of the church's leadership. Joseph and Hyrum had been willing to go to their deaths to prevent the destruction of Nauvoo. They had died for their people. Their deaths set them apart as witnesses for their faith. One account of the martyrdom, which was eventually added to Mormon scripture, eulogized Smith in no uncertain terms. He lived great, and he died great in the eyes of God and his people, and like most of the Lord's anointed in ancient times, has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood, and so has his brother Hyrum. The testators are now dead, and their testament is in force." End quote. Latter-day Saints heard and imbibed these sentiments, but they likely did not require anyone to tell them that their murdered prophet should be revered as a martyr. In fact, the rhetoric employed by hierarchical voices was only one aspect of the project of sacralizing Smith's memory. To comprehend the real impact of Smith's death, we must also look to the journal writing, dream-telling, and local gossip that was so important to everyday life in Nauvoo. By so doing, we are better able to understand the contours of Smith's reconception as a martyr, who in his death was yet perceived as consciously engaged in the divine drama. His death functioned as a hinge in the Mormon cultural conception of time, around which everything now swung. 19th century diaries, memoirs, and correspondence are replete with descriptions of the moment individuals and communities of Latter-day Saints learned of the tragedy. A saint's grief was sometimes expressed in terms of the inability to shed tears, as with Benjamin F. Johnson, who, quote, "stood up dazed with grief, or could groan but could not weep. The fountain of tears was dry." Arza Adams, in contrast, recalled the moment as a, quote, "solemn time, in which many a rosy cheek was wet with tears, both men and women." The impact of the martyrdom was so substantial that many claimed to have experienced an emotional wave of inexplicable sorrow that corresponded to the time of Smith's murder. In 1849, Orson Hyde recalled, "There was an unspeakable something, a portentous significancy, in the firmament and among the inhabitants of the earth. Multitudes felt the whisperings of woe and grief, and the forebodings of tribulation and sorrow that they will never forget, though the tongue of man can never utter it. The saints of God, whether near the scene of blood or even 1,000 miles distant, felt at the very moment the prophet lay in royal gore that an awful deed was perpetrated. Oh, the repulsive chill, the melancholy vibrations of the very air, as the Prince of Darkness receded in hopeful triumph from the scene of slaughter. That night could not the saints sleep, though uninformed by man of what had passed with the seer and patriarch, and far, far remote from the scene. Yet to them sleep refused a visitation. The eyelids refused to close. The hearts of many sighed deeply in secret and inquired, 'Why am I thus?' In memoirs, descriptions of these initial emotions are followed by descriptions of the Smith brothers' viewing. Throughout the morning and afternoon of June 29, thousands came to the Nauvoo mansion, Smith's final residence, to pay their last respects to the prophet and patriarch as they lay side by side in the large dining room. Messiah Hancock recalled the procedure for attendees. Quote, "As we came in at the door, we came to the feet of the prophet Joseph, then passed up by his left side and around his head, then down by his right side. Next we turned to the right and came to the feet of Hyrum, then up by his left side and around his head and down by his right side. Then we filed out of the other door. So the great stream of people continued until the saints all had the privilege of taking their last look at the martyred bodies." End quote. Like the bodies of earlier martyrs, they possessed a certain sanctity even while lying in their gore. Joseph Fielding suggested that the, quote, "noble appearance the two possessed in life was by no means lost in death." Sarah Rich referred to the expressions on their faces as peaceful. Others commented on the reality of two human corpses, although washed and dressed, still lying lifeless in their coffins. Gilbert Belknap was not alone in describing the brothers' remains as, quote, "mangled bodies." Multiple accounts describe Joseph as natural in his appearance, but Hyrum, quote, "had been shot in the face, and therefore he did not look very natural." End quote. Joseph Hovey wrote, quote, "Joseph looked quite natural, but Hyrum was so swelled in the face that he did not look natural." End quote. Many brought their children to see the remains of the two revered men in hopes of making a lasting impression. Mary Rich, whose father had guarded the bodies the previous night, was escorted into the mansion before the general viewing. She recalled, "I went down, saw them, and laid my hand on Joseph's forehead. The blood was oozing out of the wound in his shoulder, and the sheet that was around him was stained with blood." End quote. Another guard remained with his adolescent son at the mansion following the viewing. Messiah Hancock remembered a spontaneous ritual at the sight of the bodies. His father instructed him, quote, "to place one hand on Joseph's breast and to raise my other arm and swear with hand uplifted that I would never make a compromise with any of the sons of hell." End quote. He then repeated the oath with his hand on Hiram's corpse. The raw interaction with the bodies underscored the experience of martyrdom. As Lyman Littlefield wrote in 1888, quote, "That was an hour marked in the history of this people, and although 44 years have since passed away, the powers of memory seldom go back and review the scene, though in gleams of momentary fleetness, without sensations of pain." End quote. There is little danger of exaggerating the level of grief the saints encountered in the summer of 1844. For some it seemed to be embodied in the very landscape. Sally Randall wrote, "It seems all nature mourns." The mourning saints also experienced confusion and doubt. Some Mormons worried that Smith had died prematurely. Because of the institutionally focused histories written about this period, the question most associated with the moment is, who would take the lead of the church now that the Mormon prophet had died? However, it is possible that another question was of equal importance to many Latter-day Saints. Was Joseph Smith not supposed to live to see the temple completed, become the President of the United States, translate further sacred records, or perhaps live until the second coming of Jesus Christ? Smith's allegedly premature death was an important aspect of critics' assertions that he had become a fallen prophet, but it also consumed the devout with anxiety. In contrast, Smith's confidants regularly spoke of having heard the prophet refer to intimations of his approaching death. Not all were convinced by these claims. Isaac Scott, a Mormon who had sided with William Law, wrote, quote, "All these statements I believe are false, and got up for the purpose of reconciling the minds of the church. I believe they had not the least idea that they were going to be murdered." End quote. Yet, as with other charismatic Christians of the era, Mormons endowed with the gift of prophecy regularly foresaw their own deaths. In 1843, Smith eulogized James Adams, claiming that the deceased, quote, had had revelations concerning his departure and had gone to a more important work of opening up a more effectual door for the dead. Smith was also the recipient of revelations spelling out the timing of his death. In the days after learning of the Carthage slaying, Lyman White recounted that while he was incarcerated with Smith in Liberty, Missouri, the prophet confided to him that, quote, he should not live to see 40 years, but told him not to reveal it until he was dead, end quote. These statements were not only confined to memoirs relayed after the fact. There were numerous expressions of such forebodings recorded in the minutes of Smith's sermons. For example, in 1842, he told a meeting of the Relief Society, quote, that the church would not have his instruction long, and the world would not be troubled with him a great while, end quote. Such pronouncements will not be surprising to those familiar with R. Lawrence Moore's claim that since the beginning of his prophetic career, Smith, quote, had determined to cast himself in a martyr's role, and a considerable part of what he wrote and said was designed to further that image. By the last years of his life, his statements have become numbingly formulaic, end quote. Other historians, such as Richard Bushman, have interpreted these moments as bouts of melancholy and despair. Whether we interpret them as part of Smith's own psychology or as his deliberate self-portrayal as predestined martyr, Smith's predictions of his death were not only a matter of post facto fantasy. Accounts of Smith's seeming foreknowledge of his martyrdom softened the blow that the Mormon prophet had died before he could administer the anticipated endowment within the completed temple. Often when the apostles spoke of Smith's premonitions of his death, it was in reference to his entrusting them with these rites. He had been, quote, constrained to pass on the most valuable revelations in order that they would not be lost. Recalling his own reception of these rites, Joseph Fielding recorded his confidence that Smith had completed his earthly mission and was needed in the world of spirits. These reflections, in a great measure, took off the edge of the grief that I might else have felt, for I thought that he had so fulfilled his own purposes, and I felt willing to say amen to it, end quote. Mormons generally assign meaning to death by asserting that the deceased were still able to move forward with his or her mortal callings or receive additional post-mortal assignments. In reference to James Adams' death, Smith had earlier explained that to die simply meant to graduate onto a greater and more glorious work. Although Latter-day Saints tended to emphasize that Smith continued his ministry after his death through his work with spirits in prison, many also believed he remained conscious of happenings on earth and could act here as well. Benjamin F. Johnson later remembered that Smith had once assured him that, quote, "If I was on the other side of the veil, I could do many times more for my friends than I can do while I am with them here," end quote. This understanding mitigated the failed expectation that Smith was supposed to obtain the American presidency, as some of the saints anticipated he would, or at least that he would be alive to finish his bid for office. Although earlier we noted that Brigham Young was skeptical about whether Smith could obtain the necessary votes, there was a popular belief that their prophet was destined to hold presidential office. As late as 1854, Benjamin G. Ferris claimed, quote, "There are those among Smith's followers in Utah who firmly believe he would have been elected in 1844 had not his career been cut short by an untimely death," end quote. John D. Lee seems likely to have been among this number. While still campaigning in the East, he recorded an angelic visitation which he received in response to his concerns about what to do now that Smith had died. Quote, "A personage whose face shone as lightning stood before me and bid my fears depart. 'Your mission,' continued he, 'and labors are accepted. So were the 12 and 70s that were sent out by the Son of God. They supposed that their labors were lost when their leader was taken and crucified, instead of being crowned king of that nation as they fondly expected. Just so it is with you. Instead of electing your leader the chief magistrate of this nation, they have martyred him in prison, which has hastened his exaltation to the executive chair over this generation. So now return home in peace, and there wait your endowment from on high, as did the disciples at Jerusalem, for this circumstance is parallel to that.'" These visions spell out the same message undergirding so many other expressions of the Mormon faith in this period, that Smith's death would enable, rather than inhibit, the prophet to fulfill these prophecies.